Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT ranked meta video. Today I'll be doing a review of the ranked meta for patch 12.7. Overall, this has been a fantastic patch in terms of diverse compositions and champions that are playable. Of course, no patch is perfect, and the easiest criticism for 12.7 is the lack of viable low-cost builds. Most of the meta favors going towards level 8 and playing for 4 and 5 cost carries. We'll be exploring those compositions alongside items, augments, and more as we break down the 12.7 ranked meta. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get into the details of the patch, let's first talk about what the current meta is. Keep in mind that we're speaking in broad strokes here. We'll go over specific compositions later on in the video. So, broadly speaking, what is the meta? We can boil it down to one simple word: flex. Flex play is the way to go. Granted, it's not the only way to play, but in general, if you're leaving your transitions open in the mid-game, the chances are you'll have a solid comp. This can be built off of multiple synergies like Innovators, Clockwork, Enchanter, Socialite, as well as a plethora of other minor traits. The dividing point for any meta is whether you should play AP or AD. We're happy to say that both are viable, though it's definitely easier to do well with AD simply because there are more available carries to transition into. Those can be Sivir, Jhin, Jace, Jinx, Kha'Zix, or Draven, plus some outlier champions as well. AP is a bit more restrictive, as Ahri and Victor are the most common traditional carries for AP items. But there's also builds utilizing champions like Seraphine, Orianna, Malzahar, and a few others. There may be fewer options, but there are still options. As mentioned in the introduction, the pace of the game is slowed down in the early stages as most players look to spike at level 8 somewhere in stage 4 or 5. This means consistently placing in the top 4 is a bit tougher since more players are surviving later into the game. And that then also adds in extra variance like what augments and items each player has and whether any 5-cost upgrades are being hit. In general, the slower pace of the game means more impactful decisions can be made later on, which is aided by the playability of multiple different comps. All in all, it has been a good patch and definitely worthy of being used for the upcoming Worlds Tournament. Let's move into the next section where we talk about the opening carousel and meta items. To be completely honest, the component priority is player preference more than anything. One player has more preference towards AP or defensive openers, and it doesn't matter that 3 people are contesting a bow. Our takeaway for this patch in particular is that any component can be priority, besides Cloak, of course. That doesn't really answer the question as to what components are higher in priority. To answer that, we have to look at it in a few different ways. One of the most contested champions in the meta is Sivir, and what does Sivir need a lot of? Bows. That naturally puts Bow higher up on the priority list. Bow builds in the GiantSlayer, Rageblade, and Last Whisper. Rageblade is specific to Sivir, but the other two are playable on a lot of other champs. That means both Sword and Glove are also high in value since they build into flexible AD items. Both components also build into an Infinity Edge, which is another common AD item. With that knowledge in mind, the safest opening carousel components is any of Bow, Sword, or Glove. That said, Rod Opener also has value with Locket as an early defensive slam or Morellonomicon for added utility. Tier isn't high up in priority unless the player prefers AP openers and AP boards in general, then a tier is very valuable. Chain Vest and Belt are always good default options if nothing else is available since they both build into a lot of slammable early game items. This includes the ones we already listed, but there's also Bramble Vest, Sunfire, Cape, Frozen Heart, or Warmogs. Overall, there's plenty of wiggle room for components and items. Some games your items may be doomed in the mid game for your carry, but on average, that shouldn't happen too often. Time for the early game beginning with Stage 1. As usual, not much to be done in this stage other than finding pairs and aiming for certain openers. Auto attack and AD openers in general are going to be more successful early game, so if your goal is to win streak, we recommend looking for champions like Ezreal, Caitlyn, Twitch, Warwick, or Talon. Some of those do get outscaled quickly, but in Stage 2, most of them are fine as carries. The other thing to look for in your early game, not just in Stage 1, is Mercenaries and Yordles. Ideally, you want either of those traits active immediately on 2-1, but it can be delayed 1 or 2 rounds. Both of these openings are lost streak focused, so we don't recommend playing that style if you're uncomfortable being below 70 health in Stage 3. The first major decision to the game is the 1-4 augment. On average, the best way to go about the first augment of the game is deciding what gives you the best chance at scaling into the mid game. Often this means going for either a win or loss streak, which augments are fantastic at. Early win streak augments to look at are any of Cybernetic augments, Thrill of the Hunt, Luden's Echo, Phalanx, Backfoot, True Twos, or Weak Spot. Specific augments that you can win streak with are things like Featherweights, which either locks you into early game units or basically lose an augment late game. Double Trouble used to be quite strong, but has fallen off with the lack of reroll comps in the meta. Built Different is possibly the strongest win streak augment, but it can be hard to use effectively, so be aware of that. This doesn't cover every single possible option, but those are at least a few good augments to begin with. Lost Streak is a bit harder to do because it mostly comes down to board strength or lack thereof, but any econ augment is often good for losing early since you're not gaining any combat value from the augment. That said, you can always take early gold and level aggressively, which is another way to win rounds. What we advise against is playing anything too specific unless it gives you good value. Mercenary traits, for example, can be good in value if you're going to have the trait active in Stage 2. Junkyard is another case of it's almost always good, but you definitely need to have Scrap active. Anything too specific is just lowering the amount of options you have later on in the game, and on 1-4, you ideally don't want that restriction. Let's now move on to Stage 2. Stage 2 is all about streaks, whether that's losing or winning. The easiest way to try to win is to level early and slam an item with your available components. That plus your augment is often enough to at least win a few rounds. Going on a full win streak requires a bit of luck, but proper positioning and scouting for threats like Talon or Blitzcrank can be a great way to squeak out wins. Lost streaking is fairly easy in the sense that you just want to lose. Scout, see who else is weak, and then position in a way that guarantees you lose against that player. It's a difficult playstyle because you're sacrificing health for economy, but it is an effective way to play the early game. A lot of Stage 2 comes down to player knowledge, knowing what boards are strong, when to make transitions, and what synergies can help the most. Since it's such a pivotal part of the game, we highly recommend watching streams and actively paying attention to high-ranked players' decisions in Stage 2. Picking up even one or two things will easily elevate your early game. On to Stage 3 in the mid-game, where, for the most part, players just want to be hitting level 6 and skipping past without having to roll. If you've been hard losing since Stage 2, then yes, you do need to roll to stabilize. Stabilize means finding an item holder, ideally upgrading them, and having an active trait in frontline. Don't roll too much because level 7 and 8 are pivotal transitions in this meta. The only major decision to make in this stage is the 3-3 augment. A lot of the augments we talked about in 1-4 are still viable on 3-3. The general notion behind the 3-3 augment choice is taking anything that benefits your board in Stage 4. This is because usually you have at least some idea of what your board is going to be by the 3-3 augment. Not an exact composition, but at least knowing whether it's likely going to be AD or AP. Also possible to play more specific trait augments on 3-3, though we still advise against it unless you already have units pertaining to those augments. For example, a striker emblem is tempting to take, but if you don't have a Sivir or other strikers, you may end up in a pickle later on if you never find a Sivir. But if you do have a board that works well with strikers, then it's fine to take. At the end of the day, if you're truly unsure of what to take, just bet on playing it safe and take whatever benefits your board right away. Now for the bread and butter of the meta, Stage 4. Here's where almost every player is going to be hitting level 7 and rolling a small amount of gold or more if they're low on health. Level 8 is the goal, but sometimes to stabilize, you need to roll a bunch on level 7, which is still fine. Look for your main carry, the synergies that best suit them, and a solid frontline. The exact composition can be pieced together over time, but stabilizing with a carry and frontline is the easiest way to get to level 8 unless you've been high rolling all game. We'll talk about level 8 soon, but first let's go over a few of the meta compositions. For any reroll fans, unfortunately the meta has moved away from them with the exception of an occasional Warwick or Talon reroll. Nothing has changed for those boards, so we only advise playing them if you absolutely high roll the early game. The rest of the meta is all about getting a 4 or 5 cost carry. Sivir is by far the most contested with the meta board of 4 striker and 4 scrap. Aurelia and Jinx are both capable secondary damage dealers, while scrap adds extra survivability. Innovators in general are doing well as a foundational trait for a lot of carries like Jace, Zeri, and Jhin. Even Draven is playable, but it's hard to pull off a Draven comp effectively. As for AP, there's either Arcanist with Ahri, Renata Bruiser, or various Victor boards. Generally speaking, Victor and Renata are more reliable than Ahri, but to scale into the late game effectively, it is usually required to have a Silco. Low-cost AP carries are far less reliable, such as Lucian, Corki, or Malzahar, but they can still be played in the mid-game as item holders. Finally, Mutants. Mutants are almost as strong as Sivir on average, though the mutation changes this game to game. That said, Kha'Zix is actually reliable now after he's been changed half a dozen times throughout the mid-set. And finally, you can always just play a flex board piecing together whatever you want as long as you have items and augments for it. Speaking of augments, let's quickly cover the final 4-6 augment. As usual, this augment is all about player choice based on your current board. Whatever holes your board has, this is the time to fill them with an augment, whether that's damage, utility, or other. The only thing we suggest not taking is an econ augment unless gold is the only way you survive the next round. Otherwise, stick to what your board needs and don't worry about getting too specific. And finally, we're into the late game. Level 8 actually can be anywhere between 4-2 and 5-3, though ideally earlier the better. The rule of thumb is to have around 30 gold to roll with after leveling, that way you can make meaningful upgrades. Overall, late game is pretty stock standard. Put together your board, find a few 5-cost units, and you're good to go. Level 9 is far more common than it has been in previous metas, but is still predicated on having both the health and gold to get there. If you're on the struggle bus, well, rolling on 8 is the way to go. As always, the most important part of the late game is positioning and scouting. Focusing on those two mechanics will help your average placement far more than anything else in the late game. This is another area where watching streams can be useful, though it is also something that can be worked on with enough games played. That's all for today's video, folks. It's great to see a meta that feels relatively balanced, although Sivir is always an outlier in that regard. Keep in mind that while we are getting a new patch soon, the 12.7 patch is what will be used for the upcoming Worlds Tournament. Let us know in the comment section below who you're going to be cheering for in the upcoming tournament. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.